So let's just start kind of high level. And just for the people that don't know, and I think like a lot of people are going to know, but just for the people that don't know, what is the 4DX system?
Okay, in a nutshell, it's a way to execute on the hardest part of your strategy in the face of competing priorities and distractions. And that part of the strategy almost inevitably revolves around a significant change in human behavior or something that requires a high degree of human engagement. So that's sort of a capsulized,
yeah, sure,
definition. So, go anywhere you want with that.
Yeah, sure. So we're talking strategy plus execution, right? So it's combining the two parts, right? And so within the system, what would you say is harder? Is it harder to create the strategy, or is it harder to execute, or are they just both important?
Yeah, well, what's interesting, Alex, is that the longer we looked at this, we saw that they dance together all the way through, that you have a very difficult time. There was even an HBR article written on this a few years back, that you have a very difficult time delineating where strategy starts and where execution begins. But in a general sense, if you just said to someone, what's harder, strategy or execution? Like, people get what you mean by that. Like, there's the planning, and then there's the, okay, we got to put legs on this thing. We got to get it off the ground. And what's funny is that's how this whole thing started for Franklin Covey 20 years ago. Was Ram Charan was working with our executive team, and he asked us two questions. What's harder, strategy or execution? And we said, execution. No, he didn't say what's harder.
Well, execution does sound harder, right?
It does, right?
The work after.
Right. He said, what do leaders struggle with more? Do leaders struggle more with strategy, or do they struggle more with execution? And we've been, Franklin Covey, 7 Habits, Stephen Covey, we've been deep in leadership development. And we very quickly said, oh, they struggle way more with execution. And then his next question got us. And his next question was, what do we educate them in? What do we teach them? If they get an MBA, if they go to business school, do we teach them about execution? And it was like, that was the shot that just sank. And we just started dedicating more and more energy and resources to that question.
Because it does seem that many leaders can create strategies, right? Like, I think some people create a strategy every week. Some people create a strategy per day. But the missing link in strategy is executing on it effectively, right? And so I do think it's a combination of that. So let's just kind of unpack that quickly, right?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alex.
How do you define strategy?
There are a lot of definitions that various people use, but the very technical definitions we found aren't that helpful because they're not that well understood. And so I find myself actually softening the term strategy rather than trying to put sharp lines on it just so I can relate to people. So I will soften it by saying, asking people to talk to me about their strategic intent. And one of the ways that I do that is I get them to think about the difference between all the energy required today to maintain the operation versus where are you trying to go. And that little delineation gets them to open up a little bit. Like if I ask for a Bain or McKenzie definition of strategy, like their brains lock up, right? Yeah, they're like, oh, I'm gonna screw this up, right? And I've read Michael Porter, and I'm still gonna screw this up.
Right.
But if we soften it, and I'm like, sometimes I'll even step away from the word strategy, and I'll just be like, what's the plan? Where are you trying to go? What's the direction? Where are you trying to, like, every leader has got sort of two things. They've got to keep the operation going and profitable and healthy and surviving. And then you got to be taking it somewhere. And it's the, where are we taking it that seems to encompass strategy.
I really like that thinking because, we did a podcast recently with Roger Martin, right? And he's a strategy expert and it's really, really good, but it's also really, really daunting to think about that level of kind of thinking of strategy and like the downsides and the risks and the ups and downs and all the different parts, right? And I do like the simplicity of like, so where do you want to go? So that's such a simple
But we went the other way.
Ask yourselves, right?
Yeah. Nobody can, they would just get so consternated and embarrassed. And instead of just, rather than, beating people up with terminology, these are bright people. They didn't, our CEO has an expression. If you see a person on the top of a mountain, you can be pretty sure they didn't fall there.
I like that one.
These are not stupid people. You don't do yourself any favors by treating them that way.
Yeah.
And They got to where they got because of some either conscious or intuitive genius. And so, we try and really understand, where are you trying to go? What are you trying to do? And the less boxes we put them in, the better we sort of start to understand that strategic intent. Because
this is the part, right, is that I think all leaders inherently know what they, and in quotation marks, should do, right? But and in your book, you talk about the whirlwind, right? Which is about it's all the stuff that's in an organization that just keeps everybody busy, that takes away time from thinking, from being proactive, from being intentional with actually how they spend their time, right? And so this way of thinking about, of course, where do you want to go, really is a conversation, and it takes away a lot of the pressure, right? Which I think is fantastic, because everybody can have that conversation and they don't need a framework behind it. But if they did have to have a few little things, a few little questions, what will be some of the questions that they should be asking themselves?
So one of the things that we've found very helpful is we call it a framework for execution. So to sort of, let me say it this way. We even before we get into the disciplines, we take a look at that strategic intent through an execution lens. So we say, if all of your have to do directional intent sort of lived in a big bubble, if you broke that bubble into 3 categories, let's dissect it, right? Let's break it down. Let's say, and these categories are more from an execution perspective than a strategy perspective. But it's interesting, just the exercise of breaking it down, you can feel the blood pressure in the room lower.
Lower.
Lower. Just sort of okay, because when it's all together, it's overwhelming. We want to do this, but we don't even know how to do this. And before we can do that, we got to do this thing. And we know that's contingent on this. And we don't even control those factors. And then their ears start bleeding. Right? So
I know. I've been there before.
Okay, you've been there. You know what that feels like.
Yeah.
And we say, okay, so in terms of all the stuff that you got to do, let's start to make a list of those elements that are going to be executed through what we call a stroke of the pen. Now, it's not as easy as a stroke of the pen, but they're things that require management, leadership, authority, or financial resources. We've got to restructure. We've got a critical acquisition. We discontinued a third of our product line. We're moving the manufacturing process in this direction. All right. These are things that are kind of going to happen because we said so. So we sort of we sort of take a number of elements out and set it over there, and they go, big consequences, takes brains, takes guts, but it's going to happen. Okay. Then on the other side, we say, okay, now give me those elements of the plan that are necessary for life support, that are necessary just for sustaining the way that the thing runs today. So these are things that are associated with your existing KPIs, with existing metrics. And they don't have a hard time with this. They go, yeah, that's new, but it's really just a variation of this. And that's going to happen in conjunction with something else that's going on. And so they start to parse between these two worlds of, management authority, stroke of the pen, right? Chess moves.
Yes.
And life support, vital signs, work. And so as they start to make these two lists, there's this empty, there's this third column. And the third column is for the stuff that doesn't fit. And if it doesn't fit, because it can't get done there. So yes, we changed the product mix, but just because we did that doesn't mean the sales force is going to actually follow us. Because in order for this to work, the sales force has got to change who they're talking to. And I was there someplace yesterday. It's a software company, and they're in a beautiful spot. The whole thing hinges on the fact that 100 people have to start talking to somebody new, and they don't think they're scared to death of that. And it won't it can't happen in the day job, because the existing inertia won't allow it to happen, and we can't buy it. And some of it's funny. Some of them are like, I'd spend the money. I'd write $1 million check if I could get this.
Of course, we all would.
Right, they can't buy it, and they can't mandate it. And it's these things in the middle, this column we call breakthroughs. And they're things that require, so just by that very simple breakdown between stroke of the pen, life support, and breakthroughs, you feel the blood pressure start to go down because they go, yeah, you know what? Okay, I can see this now a little clearer.